that you were placed into a cell with yourself and a Bible, and that was it. And this became how people were housed for years on end. Does anyone know what these early prisons were called? It's a terminology, a term we sometimes use still today. They were called penitentiaries, because that was where you would go and pay your penance in order to, again, right your relationship with God, right your relationship with the state, right your relationship with those maybe you have harmed, and then return to society after that. So the early prisons called penitentiaries. So the movement to create prisons was a reform idea from progressive Protestant Christians. There were also a lot of Unitarians and Universalists involved in the early Pennsylvania system that the Quakers were taking the lead on in the 1700s. There was another system that was also being used in New York that was called the Auburn system, which was using prisons as a place of labor, that rather than right your relationship with God or the state through prayer and quiet, the idea was that you would right your relationship with those that you would cause harm by laboring, by doing work. And so it was essentially an enslavement system, because it was people who, without any choice, were forced to work for not private companies at that time, but were forced to work in order to maintain themselves while they were incarcerated. So the Auburn system was one where you were forced to work. The Pennsylvania system was where you were forced to be in solitary confinement. And these were the early ways that we were doing incarceration in the United States, breaking away from corporal punishment and turning instead to these new prisons. So it seemed like this was a good movement, right? Because torturing people in public, not so great. Not something we want to do. So getting away from torturing people in public seemed like a good direction. One of the biggest challenges, though, is from the beginning of the existence of prisons, those who were considered disposable by society were always the ones who magically happened to be the ones who were incarcerated. So back in the 1700s, that was a lot of immigrants, particularly Irish immigrants, were the ones who were disproportionately incarcerated. Not because people with marginalized identities necessarily cause more harm or do more crime or break more laws, but because when we have the policing system that's designed to target those who are considered disposable or expendable in our culture, they then end up being rounded up and incarcerated by the system that is designed to survive off of the destruction of certain communities. There were not an enormous number of Black folks incarcerated at that time. Why? Slavery, yes. So the punishment and regulation and control of Black bodies was done primarily through chattel slavery. There were some enslaved folks who were held in prisons, and there were some free folks in the Northeast who were incarcerated, but it was disproportionately white European immigrants, Italians, Irish, some Polish folks that were being incarcerated. So again, the focus was not really about ending or stopping harm or violence from happening, because there was plenty of harm and violence happening all over the place, and only certain folks were the ones who were getting incarcerated. So the early prisons were designed to keep those who were undesirable locked away from society for whatever length of time any judge decided to sentence would send somebody away for. And so the US prison system functioned until the end of the Civil War as primarily an incarceration system of white folks. After the end of the Civil War, we begin to see what was called the convict leasing system, which is again when we have the privatization of incarceration happening. And this privatization, sorry, I keep trying to figure out, you all here? The privatization of the punishment of incarcerated folks led to people being taken from prison, from their incarceration situations, and put back in the same field sometimes that they had already gotten freed from chattel slavery, but through the convict leasing system, private plantation owners could rent, essentially, humans to come and work on their plantations. And so that's kind of the beginning of seeing private folks making money off of people's incarceration and the labor of incarcerated folks. The prison system itself wasn't growing significantly between 1865 and 1930. It was a pretty stable trajectory of growth. It wasn't going particularly higher than our population. But then we see a huge change in that. And we see what Michelle Alexander has called the growth of mass incarceration, and what others have called mass incarceration, where we see huge amounts, particularly Black men, being incarcerated starting in the 60s. And this happens in large part as a response to the civil rights movement, and as a punishment for the ways that Black folks were getting more rights, getting more access to power, were getting more access to society. Policing started getting more resources, funding, and were targeting Black communities. And it led to the beginning of the mass incarceration movement of Black folks. And so by the 70s, there were about 1 million people in prison, whereas just a few years earlier, there had been only about 450,000 people in prison. So we see these huge growths in incarceration, and almost entirely of Black folks. The 1970s then sees the beginning of the prisoner rights movement. And you see prisoners organizing in California, in New York, in Florida, in Texas, kind of all over. Prisoners are doing organizing work. We have a story right here in Massachusetts that's been talked about quite a bit at community church over the years, when the prisoners ran Walpole, is what the story is called. And it was when the prison guards went on strike at Walpole Prison, and then the prisoners created a multiracial community of prisoners who kind of ran things while the prison guards were on strike. There was a solidarity movement of folks outside of prison who were working and building community with incarcerated folks, coming up with ways to kind of run things inside and keep people as safe as possible. It is suggested that during the time of the prisoners running Walpole, that there was not a single incident of sexual assault that happened while they were running things. That's the story that people claim. True or not, who knows? But there was this growth of prisoner movements and the politicization, of prisoners, so that people were seeing prisoners as a class of people who were deserving of organizing power. And so similar to workers outside of prison, there was this idea that we needed to mobilize incarcerated folks to fight for their own liberation, fight for changes in conditions of confinement, fight for education programs, fight for recognition, and to fight to get free. Has anyone heard of the Attica uprising? A few folks have. So that was one of the beginning moments of the prisoners' rights movement, when prisoners kind of took over Attica prison, and they took a bunch of hostages, and mostly prison guard hostages, trying to force the prison to do a number of key things. One, they wanted them to fire a whole bunch of racist prison guards, and they had a list of folks they wanted to get rid of. They wanted programming to come in so that they could take care of themselves and have something to do while they were incarcerated. They wanted a reduction in sentences because they were seeing these astronomically long sentences that people were being forced into. They were fighting for a whole list of things. And so there was a lot of national attention that was given to this moment when prisoners were taking over and were saying, we are going to have a say over how we're being treated during the time that we are incarcerated. And so they took over the prison for about 4 days. And then it was responded to with enormous, overwhelming violence. by Rockefeller, the governor of New York at the time. He was on the phone and communicating with President Nixon and strategizing together about how they were going to take back this prison. And so then they sent in the National Guard and state police and killed, I think, 19 prisoners and 4 prison guards. And they were all killed by bullets from the National Guard and the state police. There were enormous lies put out about that, suggesting that it was the prisoners who had armed themselves and had killed, some of the people inside. But over the years following, it was disproven that the prisoners had killed anybody, that they'd all been shot and killed by the National Guard and the state police. So this is the treatment that we see of prisoners. When prisoners try to articulate their own rights, when prisoners try to fight to be treated like humans, when prisoners try to change conditions of confinement, the state responds with overwhelming violence. And so in the 1970s, we go from having 1 million people in prison to today, where we have 2.2 million people who are incarcerated in the United States, and 5 million more people are either on probation or parole. So the function of the prison industrial complex, a term that's been popularized by Angela Davis, is to regulate and control Black, Latino folks, and then poor white folks. The system is really designed in that way. Because we know, when we think about harm that is happening in our society, the vast majority of the harm that happens isn't addressed by incarceration. Most people who kill people don't go to jail. Most people who sexually assault somebody don't go to jail. So when we're talking about abolition, one of the biggest things that comes up is, well, what are we going to do with all these terrible folks who are doing terrible things, who are causing lots of harm? And abolition is not just about tearing down what already exists. It is also, as Angela Davis says and Ruth Wilson Gilmore say, it is a generative process. Abolition, just like the abolition of the chattel slavery system, was not only about freeing enslaved Black people, but it was also about the creation of the Reconstruction movement, right, where we were building up the power of Black folks. So too does the abolition of the prison industrial complex, or what people also call as the carceral state, that this system, trying to get rid of this system as it exists today, is also about imagining a transformative or restorative way of doing justice, where those who experience harm and victimization are able to get their needs met, be supported in how they want to experience justice, and where people have the opportunity to transform and change their behavior. If we understand violence in our society to be more than just interpersonal violence, but also these big systems and institutions of violence, then there are so many folks in power who are committing some of the worst atrocities in the world, and they will never spend a day in jail, right? Not only will they not spend a day in jail, they're actually going to make millions and sometimes billions of dollars while they're exploiting and destroying our planet, exploiting and destroying people's lives. And so our prison system isn't really about ending harm. Our prison system is about regulating communities of color and poor communities. Because we've had harm and violence forever, and we haven't had prisons forever. We've had harm and violence that is caused by people in power, and they get out of being held accountable over and over and over again. And so who ends up getting incarcerated is poor folks, communities of color, and those who are considered disposable by our society. LGBT and HIV positive folks are also disproportionately incarcerated. Gender nonconforming folks are disproportionately incarcerated. People with mental illness and other disabilities are disproportionately incarcerated. You can see the way that as our society, so in the United States, as we see a disinvestment from social service and a disinvestment from social care, we see an increased investment in incarceration. And so, for instance, when we shut down all of the mental hospitals, so many of them, released to everybody with no real plan about what we were going to do with people struggling with mental illness, we end up seeing those same folks. There's almost a direct correlation between people coming out of mental health hospitals and then being incarcerated almost immediately thereafter, the years following. So you can see wherever we see decreases in public services, we see an increase in incarceration. The same thing is true for schools. When we see a decrease in resourcing of schools, we see an increase in incarceration. Same thing is true for welfare. We see a decrease in access to welfare, we see an increase in incarceration. And so a term that people are using more and more over the last decade or so, maybe it's longer than that, and I'm not exactly sure who coined the term, but people talk about the carceral state. That the government that we live under, that its primary function is carceral, is the argument of folks who talk about the carceral state. Because not only are prisons incarceration systems, but the ways that we run our schools are very similar to the ways that we run our prisons. The ways that youth are targeted for, the suspension and expulsion. The structure of school is not so much about actually necessarily learning and growing an educated body of people, but it's about regulating folks into capitalist workers, right? And to serve the function of capitalism. And that discipline and punishment, as Foucault would talk about it, is used to regulate the behavior of young people. And so the state, what we are being offered by the state, is so often these carceral structures. When we look at the way that TANF or welfare works today, it is done in such a way that if you, as somebody who is on welfare, get in trouble with the law, you can lose access to your food stamps. How is it possible that we could ever say somebody shouldn't be entitled to food simply because of some other aspect of their behavior? The state is using these punishment-based systems to kind of run every aspect of the state's functionality. How our US military functions around the world is essentially as a giant police state going over the entire world, where the United States decides when and how we want to intervene. And since 9/11, that's really been almost exclusively in Muslim majority countries, bringing both a sense of Christocentrism and US imperialism to discipline and punish, to control and regulate brown bodies. And that's, the functionality of the state is a carceral one. Abolitionists vary in terms of their opinions of whether they are anarchists or statist communists or progressive Democrats. There's kind of a wide variety of political opinions of what we should be doing instead and how we could or should be structuring society. And it takes the most important part that people do agree on is that it takes community efforts to actually build these alternatives, and that it takes small communities trying things out and trying to imagine what abolition looks like. And so I would suggest that the Community Church of Boston is, in a way, its own abolitionist body, by saying we are going to build relationships with currently incarcerated folks. We're going to maintain those relationships because we know that everybody is more than the worst thing they've ever done in their lives. And that is one of the key things that Unitarian Universalism teaches us about in our theology, that we know that we are part of a interconnected web of existence that we are all a part of, and that there is this oneness of the divine, however we might understand the divine, whether you believe in God or not, maybe it's your interconnectedness to the universe, that we are all part of that, and what affects one, therefore affects us all. And so we have a shared responsibility to be nurturing and taking care of those who are currently experiencing the violence of the prison industrial complex. We can talk about lots of specifics about why prisons are terrible, but we can do that as we have more conversation after. But the framework that I think is so important about abolition is that it is a practice of hope. Greg and I were just talking about this idea of hope yesterday, that it is so easy for us to lose hope during these times. When we've had a Trump presidency, when we had the largest military budget that has ever been seen anywhere ever in the world right now, it is easy to lose hope. When we can say that 1 in 9 Black men are currently incarcerated, that's outrageous. How is it that we can live in a society that thinks that that's okay? And we can lose hope because it's really hard to come up against these big systems. And yet, no matter what, no matter when there have been these horrible things happening throughout our human history, there has always, at every step of the way, been people resisting and creating new things, imagining a better world and believing that that is possible. Arundhati Roy, right, is quoted as saying, another world is not only possible on a good day, I can hear her breathing. But there is possibility out there. So abolitionists, I would suggest, are folks connected to a really deep sense of hope, that we can do and will do things that are different and transformative and create the world that we dream of. And so what might that look like? When I lived here in Boston, we were trying to figure out how to deal with some instances of sexual violence that happened in some of the radical left community here in the city. And we did restorative justice circle practices where people who had been victimized were able to speak their truths and be heard, where people who had caused harm had circles around them, where they were being held accountable for the harm that they had caused, not just being thrown away to the prison system, but where we were saying, we are invested in your transformation. We believe that you can change. We believe that you, are more than this terrible choice, this behavior that you did. And it was a survivor-led effort, which I think is a really powerful way of building community and building a sense of self amongst those who have been victimized, to then have the power to control the system that is affecting the behavior of those who have done the harm. And I think it's really important for us to highlight that prisons, again, do not do the work to end violence. Instead, prisons are themselves a form of violence. The systems that happen inside, whether people are being held in solitary confinement and experiencing torture, whether people are experiencing sexual violence from prison staff or other prisoners, people are being denied access to healthcare, people are being denied access to work. The list goes on and on and on. And so abolition is this vision of doing something different. Abolition is this idea that we have the power to come up with new solutions that will authentically hold people accountable and actually make sure that there's transformation in our communities. That's the key vision of abolition. All right, I think your clock on here doesn't.
Yes, it's a wrong
I was
time.
like, this isn't right.
Somebody tell Casey what time it is.
We're at 12:02. Great, good to know. All right, so Jada and I talked about Jada saying a couple of words. Do you still want to say a couple of words, Jada?
Yeah.
You want to come sit here? I'll shift. You can shift somewhere.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Jada, and I'm visiting with the youth group of the Second Unitarian Universalist Church of Chicago. It's great to be here. And I've lived in Chicago my entire life, and I am no stranger to the police and how unfair the United States judicial system is. And Chicago gang culture is one of the most infamous and well-known gang cultures in the world. And I'm only 15 years old, yet I'm no stranger to gun violence, gang violence, and other things of the sort. And it is dangerous for me to even walk down the street at certain times of the day. And the Chicago police system plays a huge role in Chicago gang culture. Like, leaders will assign minors to do jobs so they'll get out by the time they're 21. And this is arguably one of the most prevalent reasons why the cycle of gang violence is seemingly never ending. due to the never-ending prison cycle. It goes further than just gang violence or gang violence in Chicago. Police all over the country are prone to racially profile people of color. I didn't type that right, it was a little mistake.
You're doing right.
Okay, people all over the country are prone to racially profile people of color youth or POC youth, which is why the ratio between white people and people of color in jail is unbalanced. And prison doesn't do much to reform one's behaviors because nearly 44% of all prisoners in the US return to prison less than a year after being released. And that number is outrageous, arguably. And I've had friends arrested and charged for things much heavier than the petty crimes that they have committed, likely because they are Black and Hispanic. The US is a pretty messed up place, but the prison and jailing system isn't making it any better. There are places similar to Chicago where the policing and prison system isn't fixing, but feeding into the crime that does take place. This isn't right, and nearly every American citizen unanimously agrees that this isn't right, but nobody's doing anything to fix it. As a Black person in America, I shouldn't fear to face harsher consequences for something that a white citizen did as well. I shouldn't have to look over my shoulder walking down the street or worry about what colors I wear in certain neighborhoods in my city. I'm not safe, we're not safe, and something has got to be done.
Thanks, Dan.
Beautiful, appreciate you, Jada. One of the things that I just want to highlight is, or one of the scholars, if you haven't read things by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, she's somebody that I would encourage everyone to check out. One of the things that I really appreciate about her vision of how we talk about the prison industrial complex, carceral state, and abolition, is she reflects on the ways that incarceration is designed to specifically target what she calls surplus Black labor. So in the 60s and 70s, as Black folks were getting more access to the labor market and getting more access out of legal segregation, there were too many Black folks to fill the amount of positions, the amount of spaces there was for actual work to be done. And so the response by the state was to further criminalize Black life and to make it so that Black folks would be targeted by police and then disproportionately affected by mandatory minimum sentencing and things like that. And so she highlights that when we are thinking about the ways that capitalism is benefiting from incarceration, it is not so much that we are forcing prisoners to work, because actually the majority of incarcerated folks are not working. The majority of incarcerated folks are pushed into what we could call coerced docility, where they are not able to labor in any way for themselves or for their families. And so the theft of Black labor that is happening is not so much the theft of Black labor for white profiteering. That does happen, there are aspects of that, but it's about 8% of incarcerated folks are in privatized prisons. So that number hasn't changed. The number of people has changed a lot, but the percentage hasn't changed really since the 1800s. It's really been about 8% of the incarcerated population is in privatized prisons. I'll talk about how that's different for immigration detention in just a second. But what is really important to understand about this forced docility is it means that Black folks are unable to create wealth for their own families. So we're seeing the racial wealth divide get worse and worse and worse decade after decade because Black folks are unable to create wealth for their family because of the impact of incarceration. So when we talk about, did anyone see the documentary The 13th? That was, okay, so Ava DuVernay made this documentary The 13th. There are many aspects of it that are really important and helpful and reflective that make a lot of sense. I was really grateful to get to see a conversation between Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis a few years ago in Chicago, where we got to see them disagree. I feel like we never get to see our scholar activists that we look up to disagree with each other, and it was really neat to see them disagree. where Angela Davis sees the focus on private prisons to be an important entry point for folks to get involved in the movement for abolition. Whereas Ruth Wilson Gilmore says that the focus on private prisons is a red herring, and that we are missing the functionality of what's actually going on with the prison industrial complex when we overly focus on private ownership. I fit in the Ruth Wilson Gilmore camp myself, because what I find really compelling is that the capitalist corporations are more so a leech upon the prison industrial complex and the carceral state, as opposed to the primary force behind it. In all cases, except for immigration detention. The Corrections Corporation of America, who's changed its name now for the 5th time or something like that, they helped write numerous pieces of legislation, particularly SB 1070 in Arizona, a law in Georgia, the number I don't remember, and a couple of others, where immigrant detention centers, about 70% of people in immigrant detention centers are in privately run immigration detention centers. That versus the 8% for criminally sentenced folks is radically different, right? And so when it comes to immigrant detention, there's definitely a key driver from private corporations that are making it happen in the way that it does. And there are contracts with the federal government that mandate a percentage of the beds to be filled at all times. And if it goes below that percentage of beds, they actually get more money than they are originally entitled to for the incarceration of people in immigration detention. So there's so much incarceration, there's so much carceral structure, and it gives us so much that we have to fight back against. And I think what my hope that you could get out of this conversation today is that there are people who are coming up with other ideas, and that abolition is the immediate need to get people free, to fight for more commutations, like the commutation for R&D King, and we should see huge commutation efforts all around the country to get more people freed immediately, and then have re-entry systems like the Black and Pink Massachusetts has a house, to having a system where people are supported and nurtured and cared for when they're getting out, and not just being surveilled, right, for more punishment. Because as Jada said, I thought the number was higher than 44%, but reincarceration rates, or what people call recidivism, is so high. But if we are doing more support for people who are getting out of prison, we can starve the prison system. Because our goal is to stop having people get incarcerated, stop having people get reincarcerated, and this takes efforts of decriminalization. We were talking just this morning, I forget, about potentially the decriminalization of drugs, right? That drug users all around are being incarcerated because of their addiction, and rather than incarcerate people because of their addiction, what if we offer treatment and care and compassion? And we know that addiction is fed in large part because of systems of capitalism, because of the divorcing of people from one another. And so if we are coming up with alternative economics and alternative ways of sharing community, which I think church is part of that, is a community of people looking out for each other, all of that gives us the power to imagine something different. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so I want to wrap myself up. But the visions of abolition that are being articulated by people all around the world involve both creation and destruction. Both are needed. We need to get rid of things as they are, and we need to create things that are new. And I'm so thankful to get to have a conversation with you all about that this morning. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jason. To quote Howard Zinn, prisons cannot be reformed any more than slavery can be reformed. They have to be abolished. Howard Zinn of blessed memory, who spoke at Community Church a whole bunch of times, and whose cassettes we are discovering in our archives and digitizing them. Find them on our YouTube channel. We put them up and they immediately get thousands of views. He was just so right on. Not only that, but just so funny and so human. Howard Zinn is just a wonderful legacy that we have. And we're going to actually have a Sunday in December devoted to hearing excerpts from those talks that he gave throughout the 70s and 80s, all the way into the 90s. The last one, I think, is 2000. So thank you, Jason. I just wanted to take this moment to speak the names of our members behind bars. And just ask you to hold them in your heart and think about them and send good thoughts their way. First one is Ms. Fantine Valjean. For money orders, officially Michael Riley, transgendered person. In Latin America, for deceased members of the struggle, we say presente. Maybe it would not be the right thing to say presente for these people, but maybe we find a word to say after each one of these names, like something like, maybe we are with you. So let's say that after each name, okay? Fantine Valjean.
We are with you.
Tariq Mihana.
We're with you. Wow.
I want to talk about Tariq in a minute. Jermaine Lewis.
We are with you.
Patrick O'Shea.
We are with you.
James Sear.
We are with you.
David Jackson.
We are with you.
Brian Peixoto.
We are with you.
And after each one of these that were released, let's say hallelujah. Arnie King.
Hallelujah!
Tommy Rosa.
Hallelujah!
And the biggest one for Lee Underwood.
Hallelujah!
Woo! Yeah, this is marvelous. And what I want to say about Tariq is that Tariq went to prison because he's a Muslim man with leftist persuasion, and after 9/11, he did stuff that I do, which is translate documents from Arab to English from places the government thought were bad places. What he did was travel behind enemy lines, which I did too in El Salvador in the late 80s and early 90s. Tariq Mahana, we gave him our Nobel. That's funny. Our Sacco and Vanzetti Award in 2003, while Jason was here.
2012.
Jason actually, 2012, thank you. 2012. Jason attended the trial, is that
I
right?
was the media spokesperson.
The media spokesperson.
For Tariq.
I talk about this because we have a Sacco and Vanzetti Award winner for this year, and their name is the Holy Land Foundation. And it's a very similar case. These were 5 successful Palestinian businessmen who created in the 90s a charity to raise funds for children in Palestine, in the West Bank and Gaza. And after 9/11, their huge charity, which provided an enormous amount of in-kind supplies, not only to the West Bank and Gaza, but also to the victims of the Oklahoma City bombing, for example. After 9/11, that charity was shut down and accused of supplying, of aiding Hamas. And these men were tried. There was a mistrial. They were retried, and there was a guilty verdict, and they were sent to long sentences of prison. And 3 of them are still in prison 20-some years later, and one of them is serving a 65-year sentence. And it's an injustice as big as the injustice visited on Sacco and Vanzetti, and there are many parallels to these 2 cases. The Holy Land Foundation were immigrants after a scare, like for them it was the Palmer raids in the late 19th and 20. For the Holy Land Foundation, it was 9/11 and the anti-Muslim hysteria that happened after that. We're going to have in December Miko Peled, who wrote a book about the Holy Land Foundation, and several members of the families of these men who had children and grandchildren now. And also we'll hear from one of them who has been released. I'm not sure if he's joining us. He was deported after he was released. I'm not sure if it's the one who's joining us from abroad somewhere or from the US. Look in our newsletter and look for that event. It's bound to be just a really marvelous celebration of these men and this suffering that's been visited on them and their family. I want to tell you about something I'm doing. I was doing it while Jason was speaking. I was listening intently though, Jason, I promise. These are postcards. On one side they say vote, Tuesday, November 8th. On the other side, I have a list of addresses in Texas, and I'm addressing them by hand and return address and stamp. And I have too many of them to get done before January 8th, or there's a guideline here that says send it by November 1st or something. So I invite you to come in and help me do this. If you have legible handwriting and you want to come on a Wednesday, which is our pupusa day, and have pupusas, Salvadoran delicacy, prepared either by our Luis, our cook, or by a restaurant in Chelsea, and help us do this. You have to address the postcard, to put a stamp on it. You have to write a quick little note, and it has guidelines of what you're supposed to write. I haven't followed those guidelines, and now I think I should. So this is a big job, needs to get done in the next maybe 10 days or so. So please come on Wednesday or any other day. Maybe if you want to stop by, we can make arrangements for you to do this project. We have quite a list of people still to cover. This is a project of either moveon.org or 350.org. I can't remember which, but this is a key midterm election coming up, and a lot of things are at stake: women's rights, democracy itself, and the climate. So get involved, and that's how we're trying to get involved. I've got one last song before maybe we have time to have a conversation with Jason. And this song has the lyrics in front here for those of you who are in presence, and there's about between 15 and 20 of us. This is a record for us, and this is a song. Doing this makes me feel just this much patriotic. Patriotic, truly. That's something that got an ugly name. But we can sing a song like this, which is kind of like a national anthem. Think about this as a national anthem. I don't think it'll ever get sung at baseball games, at the beginning. But this is, let's call it national anthem, inspired by the work of Howard Zinn. Here's the chorus. The people out there have in big letters the chorus to sing, and you can just learn it from me, from my mouth, okay? Here's the chorus. Arise, arise, I see the future in your eyes. To a more perfect union we aspire, and lift our voices from the fire. Thank you, that's beautiful. Atlantic and Pacific flow, the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico. The land between sustains us all, to cherish her, our urgent call. Here we go. Arise, arise, I see the future in your eyes. To a more perfect union we aspire, and live hungry hearts and hands. Some came by force, some by will, to the auction block and the darkened mill. Arise, arise, I see the future in your eyes. To a more perfect union we aspire, and lift our voices from the fire. We died in your fields and factories, strange fruit hanging from a poplar tree, an old coat hanger in a room somewhere, a trail of tears, an electric chair. Arise, arise, I see the future in your eyes. To a more perfect union we aspire, and lift our voices from the fire. And our great responsibility to be guardians of our liberty, till tyrants bend to the people's dreams, and justice flows like a mighty stream. Arise, arise, I see the future in your eyes. To a more perfect union we aspire, and lift our voices from the fire. One more time, here we go. Arise, arise, I see the future in your eyes. To a more perfect union we aspire, and lift our voices from the fire. We lift our voices from the fire. That song is written by Jean Rowe, and you would spell it R-O-H-E. You can find a beautiful version of it by her, as well as several other performers. And now this version that we just did for the YouTube, you can find it there as well. A conversation. Let's see, any questions in the chat? Put my glasses on and chat. There are 5 chats. Let's see. There's some announcements. Tonight is the last night of the Palestine Film Festival at 3 at Coolidge Corner Theater. 6 to 9 starting at the, today. I will repeat later is the spontaneous celebration event, the Lantern Parade. It's Jamaica Pond, tons and tons of people build lanterns and walk around the pond. It's beautiful. Thanks for that reminder. I might go there myself with my wife, who's been away for 3 weeks and is back in town right now. It just landed. Let's see, another one. Time to wrap pastries and then make sandwiches for today's feeding of Boston's homeless. That's Dan the Bagel Man and poor people at 3 downtown locations. Okay, so that's the chat. Any other questions from anybody in the room? Here's my question, Jason. Is there any place, any state of the union where any progress has been made on anything regarding prisons? Any place? Come right here so they hear you.
Sure. There are always moments of progress and moments of setbacks. So there's campaigns to end solitary confinement in pretty much every state. There are people trying hard to make that happen. There are efforts pushing for more good time so that people can get released. In Illinois, some of the key things going on there, we're about to get rid of cash bail. We already voted to get rid of cash bail And that has the potential to be a really much better system. The pandemic, as horrific as the pandemic was and as horrific as it was in prison, we also saw the largest release of prisoners that we've seen in the history of the United States since after the Civil War. So we did see lots of states releasing people in like the 2020s. They should have, 2021, 2020. They should have released a lot more people than they did, but we did see some pretty significant decarceration efforts that happened. There aren't too many super inspiring things. Here in Massachusetts, you all have an interesting data collection bill that happened that's tracking for the first time ever LGBT people's incarceration in the state. So that'll be interesting. Black and Pink Massachusetts worked on that quite a bit. So there will be more information, and information can be helpful. I also think Dean Spade reflects a lot on how we should be careful about how we are tracking data, because sometimes we're giving the system more information than we are actually interested in doing. And that can end up marginalized communities at the same time. So I think we'll kind of see what happens with that. But there are campaigns everywhere fighting to get changes to happen in different prisons and court systems and things like that around the country.
Yeah, where would I find out about those campaigns? Like if I wanted to do something to help, where would I start?
Yeah, so each state is different. So since Greg, you live in Illinois, one of the great places you can reach out to is the Chicago Community Bond Fund. They're really great. The Prison Neighborhood Arts Project is amazing. Black and Pink Chicago just changed their name to Pushing Envelopes, and they do really great work. Here, for those of you in Boston, Black and Pink Massachusetts is really great to connect to. The ACLU of Massachusetts does some really great work. And the Prison Book Project, which is based at the Quincy Unitarian Universalist Church, also really great. If you're looking to connect with Unitarians, the Church of the Larger Fellowship has a Unitarian Universalist prisoner pen pal project that you can sign up for. Black and Pink continues to have 22,000 prisoners that you can write to who are all looking for pen pals. Those are some of the things you can do.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
I would also just suggest too, you may want to research restorative justice programs, which just began about 4 or 5 years ago and garnered a lot of support from prosecutors and justices and victims, families also were involved and reaching back into the prison systems and touching base with those perpetrators there and joining a union with the victims and sharing their stories and finding forgiveness. So you may research that.
We are hearing for folks online a suggestion to connect to restorative justice programs that connect those who have caused harm with those who have been victimized and creating an opportunity for healing. For those of you, the crew of us in Illinois who are visiting, there's an amazing organization called Circles and Ciphers that's based in Rogers Park. And they do a lot of transformative restorative justice work there. Is that pretty good? Sophia.
Over the summer I did this program and it wasn't all about restorative justice, but that was one of the things. And an organization that like really helped us out was called Good Looking Out, and they
Good Looking Out.
Yeah, and they did a lot of restorative justice stuff.
Cool.
In Chicago, Good Looking Out. Good Looking Out. I think we're a wrap, Dean. Oh, there's 3 more new things here. Is USA incarceration rate going up? No. For the first time in a long time, it's not going up. It's staying pretty steady. And it's not shrinking really, but the incarceration rate is not increasing right now. Which states are instituting the best reform laws? There are some reforms that are happening kind of in lots of different places. I don't have enough of an attention on the national body anymore since I now mostly focus on Illinois. So I can't tell you who has the best reform laws. One of the things I can say though, just about the idea of reform, is we always have to be careful about what types of reforms we support. A perfect example here in Massachusetts. So many of us, including the Community Church of Boston, worked really hard to fight for CORI reform, criminal offender record information, and to ban the box in particular, get the box on applications that ask whether or not you've been convicted of a felony. Fought really hard to get those questions removed and to make it easier for people to get jobs when they're getting out of prison. What we have found, what research the Williams Institute has found in research, is that every state and city that banned the box saw an increase in racial discrimination in hiring, every single one. Because what started happening is rather than not hiring someone because of their criminal record, companies just stopped hiring Black and brown people. And there was just an increase in racial discrimination across the board. And so that was an effort that we thought was going to be really helpful, and it really hasn't been. Similarly, how it works here in Massachusetts is, I think it's after 5 years for a misdemeanor and 10 years for a felony, you can seal your record. But again, what happens there is when somebody goes and looks at your criminal record, they see that it is sealed. They don't see what you've done, but they see that you have a sealed record, which that too is leading to companies not hiring people. That if you have a sealed record, that they are choosing as an opportunity to not hire you. Also, when we were fighting for CORI reform, we were working so hard and trying to get this legislation passed through the State House, and there were compromises that got made. And one of the key compromises that got made was strengthening the sex offender registry, and particularly for homeless folks who are on the registry. Instead of having to register every month, they now have to register every week. And you can get reincarcerated if you don't re-register. And so that was one of the kind of trade-offs. To get CORI reform, we had to increase the punishment that the sex offender registry was using. You may be thinking, well, who cares? Screw sex offenders. But it's a lot more complicated than that. And the sex offender registry is a really terrible tool that does nothing to actually prevent or stop sexual violence. It's been proven over and over again to not be useful in the things that it claims to do. So we have to be careful when we look at reform efforts. We need to ask so many key questions. Some of the key ones that I try to ask myself is this something we're gonna have to abolish later? Because if it is, then I don't wanna work on it right now. Is it throwing anybody under the bus? Like, are we securing freedom for some at the expense of others? Like making the sex offender registry worse in order to get other criminally sentenced folks less time? Then we're making sacrifices that, in my opinion, are not worth it for us. And then another one I want to always think about is, are people who are most affected by the criminal legal system asking for this particular reform? So one of the things that happens is there's a lot of fight to get college classes inside the prison, which is great, but the vast majority of people in prison don't have GEDs or high school diplomas. So it'd be much more helpful to have high school and GED programs than it is to have these college programs inside. And so thinking about what are the things that people are asking for and respond to the needs of those who are most directly affected. And that's true for every social movement across every liberation struggle there ever has been. Those who are most affected by the problem are the ones who are closest to the solution. And so we should always trust that. Anything else?
Are convicted felons allowed to vote in the state of Massachusetts?
In Massachusetts, yes, convicted felons can vote once you're out of prison. Yep.
But people in prison.
People in prison cannot vote. Nope. And in most states in the country, you can't, is it most? I think it's a little more than half of the states. If you've been convicted of a felony, you can never vote again. And yeah, it's outrageous. So felon disenfranchisement, if you want to know why we've had Republican presidents anytime in the last 20 years, it is in large part to felon disenfranchisement, because we know felon disenfranchisement disproportionately affects Black folks and poor folks, and Black people disproportionately vote Democrat. And so, for instance, Florida in 2000, there were 8 million, I think. No, that's not right. I don't remember the number, I apologize. There were many people, that was fun, who were disenfranchised and couldn't vote in the 2000 election. And had they been able to vote, we wouldn't have had George W. Bush as our president. And certainly in 2016, if disenfranchised voters were allowed to vote, we would not have had Donald Trump as our president. Yeah.
I would also like to add a piece of history that up until 19, when Governor Weld was first placed in office, he was the first Republican governor to eliminate the right for prisoners to vote. Up until that time, prisoners were allowed to vote, and there were drives in each one of the prisons where people in the community were allowed to go into the prisons and have them sign up and register and vote absentee ballot.
So just hearing that up until 91, prisoners in Massachusetts could vote, and it was under Weld that right got taken away. And then it was in 2000 that Massachusetts made it so that I thought it was in 2000 that one, I know a law changed in Massachusetts, and what exactly it was around people with felonies voting changed in 2000, and I'm not exactly sure what it was. But there's changes that happen, often not for the good. Though you may recall just a few years ago now, Florida did change their law so that people with felonies can vote now. It excludes people with certain sex offenses and people convicted of murder, but everybody else is supposed to be allowed to vote now. And so that will be a really interesting dynamic for us to see in the next general election for president in Florida. Yeah. Any last thoughts to anybody else?
Jason?
Thank you all so much. Thanks for having me back at CCD 10 years later.
Come again, the sooner the better. Bring another youth group.
Yeah.
Bring these same ones. Thank you, everybody.
Jason?
And it's starting to smell really nice in here. There's tamales, and there's a bunch of sweets from yesterday's farmer's market. So in future weeks, join us. There's great stuff here to enjoy, and come on a Wednesday for our open house luncheon. Every Wednesday we're doing this with we call it Pupusa Palooza. So let's again thank Jason Lydon and his beautiful group of young folks who came. And all the rest of you who have joined us today physically, and wishing the same for all of you out there, but virtually is a good substitute, not quite the same, but it'll do, and we're glad to have you, and we're really committed to learning how to do this virtual thing with more elegance, grace, and style, and just stay tuned, and we'll figure it out over time. So, meeting at the building is over. All over this world. Amen. 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 Hallelujah. Don't forget to join us next Sunday and the one after that and then one after that. Also Wednesday is a program on Gaza. and lots of other special programs upcoming in the fall and the winter. So thank you, everybody.